When 156,000 Allied soldiers hit the beaches on June 6, 1944, one of Germany's most celebrated commanders did not see a clear path to victory. He saw the beginning of a ruin that would swallow a continent. 27 days after D-Day, as the fighting in Normandy settled into a grinding, attritional slaughter, that commander, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, had moved from blunt military calculation to a startling moral and strategic plea. The only way to spare Germany and Europe further devastation, he believed, was to stop the madness and open negotiations. Erwin Rommel's name carried weight long before the guns of Normandy boomed. To millions in Germany and beyond, he was the Desert Fox, a tactical genius whose daring armored advances through the sands of North Africa had made him a household reputation. That reputation was painstakingly cultivated, partly by his own ability to read a battlefield, and partly by a propaganda machine eager to promote a heroic face for a brutal regime. But the image and the man were not the same thing. Where the cameras and leaflets showed an emblem of national prowess, the man standing behind that image was a professional soldier whose judgment would be bent by realities Hitler could not or would not see. If you want more careful historical deep dives like this, subscribe for future episodes. Rommel's career reads like the arc of a 20th century German professional, forged by the trenches of the First World War, refined in the interwar years, and propelled into the spotlight by swift, high-risk armored warfare. As a young officer, he had shown a knack for leadership and improvisation. By the outbreak of World War II, he had become emblematic of the Wehrmacht officer corps that emphasized maneuver, audacity, and initiative. His command of the 7th Panzer in 1940, during the campaign in France, earned him early notoriety. Later, when he was dispatched to North Africa, that notoriety hardened into legend. In the desert, Rommel exploited the mobility of tanks and the vulnerability of Allied lines to build an almost mythic series of victories. Daring night attacks, rapid envelopments, and an uncanny sense of where the enemy would be weakest became the hallmarks of his conduct. The desert taught Rommel 3 lessons that would later shape his thinking on deficit and the cost of war. First, mobility means life. Without fuel and supply convoys, a bold advance becomes a corpse of middle and men. Second, the battlefield is a conversation with logistics. Victory without a line of supply is a mirage. Third, even the most skilled commander is limited by the decisions of those above him. In North Africa, the Wehrmacht's situation was not simply a matter of tactics. It was suffocated by constraints, overstretched lines, chronic supply shortages, and the strategic priorities of a high command that diverted resources to other fronts. Those limitations would follow Rommel back to Europe, shaping not only his assessments, but his growing doubts. By 1943, the tide had turned. The supply picture had worsened, and Allied air superiority made movement and reinforcement increasingly hazardous. Rommel's forces were pushed from their positions, and by 1943's end, his desert campaigns had collapsed into retreat. The man who had once been described as unstoppable now confronted a more sobering reality. Battlefield brilliance could not replace coal, fuel, and spare parts. Back in Europe, his reputation allowed him a rare platform. Hitler, eager to shore up the Western defenses against an expected Allied invasion, turned to commanders who could inspire and organize. Rommel, despite occasional public frictions with the Führer and private misgivings about political interference, was asked to take personal responsibility for strengthening the Atlantic coast. He set out a simple, if severe, logic. The Allies would not be stopped at sea. They needed to be stopped at the shoreline. If the invading armies could be brought to a halt on the beaches, Germany still had a chance to blunt the assault. To make that possible, Rommel pushed for the creation of an impenetrable barrier, a coastal gauntlet of obstacles, mines, concrete casements, and deep defensive works that together would be known as the Atlantic Wall. He was uncompromising in his methods. Concrete works were poured into the sand, hedgehogs and anti-tank obstacles were emplaced, and an obsessive focus was placed on denying easy exits from the beaches. Rommel advocated for the placement of panzer divisions close to the coast so they could be immediately counterattacking rather than languishing far inland. He believed that speed and proximity could blunt a beachhead. Yet even as he hardened the coast, he could not make the things the war required, fuel, armor, aviation, appear from nowhere. Supply shortages that had hampered him in Africa now plagued the defenses of Western Europe. Rail lines were choked, ports were limited, and Allied air power increasingly threatened movement behind the front. Rommel's defensive measures could only do so much against an opponent who threatened both the lines of reinforcement and the will to fight anchored to the regime in Berlin. If there was a final strategic blow to Rommel's hopes, it was not merely Allied firepower or the skill of their commanders. It was deception. The Allies had crafted a stratagem of illusion, Operation Fortitude, that would make commanders in Germany fear the wrong target and dilute their responses. Inflatable tanks, dummy convoys, fabricated radio traffic, and carefully managed leaks convinced German intelligence that the main invasion would come at the Pas de Calais, not Normandy. Coupled with the Allies' mastery of signals intelligence, the breaking and decoding of German communications through Enigma intercepts, fortitude ensured that German command decisions would often be based on carefully fed misinformation. Rommel, for all his talents, was not immune to this. As the Allied armada assembled and the air thickened with secrecy and false leads, the Wehrmacht's directional certainty began to fray. June 6th arrived. At dawn, the beaches of Normandy became the most violent place on earth. Rommel was not at his headquarters. By many accounts, he had returned to Germany to observe the situation at home, to attend a family matter and a birthday celebration, illustrating how ill-timed travel would become a crucial and controversial detail of that day. When news of the landings came across the lines, he acted with speed, but not with the omnipotence his public image suggested. Radio reports, misdirected intelligence, and the fragmented state of German reserves made immediate and decisive counteraction impossible. For Rommel, watching the initial reports that day was watching the beginning of a funnel. The beachhead would not merely be a tactical inconvenience, it would be the opening wedge of a campaign the Reich could not sustain. The immediate aftermath of D-Day was a brutal accounting. Allied mastery of air and sea made German attempts to move reserves perilous. Supplies dwindled. Armored counterattacks that could have, in other circumstances, regained momentum were arrested because fuel was scarce and Luftwaffe cover was unreliable. Under such pressure, a professional soldier who had once read fast and fluid battlefields with confidence began to see the arithmetic of collapse. The question shifted, not whether Germany could win militarily in the West in the traditional sense, but whether the cost of continuing to try would be worth the price in lives and in the annihilation of cities and infrastructure across Europe. It is here that Rommel's transformation becomes most consequential. The same man who had once pushed for lethal, implacable defenses now assessed that prolonging the fighting under the Nazi leadership would produce nothing but ruin. Private communications, contemporaneous letters, and later recollections provide a consistent pattern. By mid-July, in the immediate weeks after the Normandy landings, Rommel's language, private, urgent, unmistakable, shifted from purely tactical to moral. He began to entertain the political dimension of defeat. His concern was not only for military defeat, but for what unconditional prolongation meant for Germany's civilian population and the shattered continent. Among those who observed this shift was his son, Manfred. In later interviews, Manfred would describe how in the weeks after the invasion, his father had become a different man, less implacable, more weary, and more willing to voice what other senior officers only dared imply in private. Manfred remembered his father talking in tones that were not merely tactical calculations, but appeals to avert catastrophe. He recalled conversations in which Rommel expressed a desperate desire to minimize further suffering. Whether in the form of private letters, urgent conversations, or dispatches to colleagues, the themes were consistent. Overwhelming Allied superiority, dwindling supplies, and the unacceptable casualty rates made continued resistance in the West a fruitless and tragic enterprise. By the 27th day after D-Day, by late July in the calendar of 1944, those private assessments hardened into a proposition that could not stay confined to whispers. The title of this film names it plainly. Rommel, by then convinced that further warfare in the West was senseless, moved to urge negotiation. Available documentary threads, letters written in mid-July, recollections of conversations with subordinates, and the accounts of his family make clear that he had adopted a posture that favored ending the slaughter, if it was at all possible. This was not the behavior of a man seeking to overthrow the regime in a single stroke. It was rather the posture of a professional soldier who had concluded that the continuation of combat under the existing political leadership would fall beyond the limits of reasonable military conduct. To understand why this shift mattered, one must return to the context of loyalty and obedience in Hitler's Germany. The Wehrmacht was an institution built on discipline and oaths. Officers swore allegiance not to the state alone, but to the Führer as a person. The personal loyalty Hitler demanded was the social cement of the regime. For a decorated marshal to suggest negotiations with the Allies was tantamount to questioning the strategic wisdom of the Führer and, through implication, the regime itself. On one hand, such a stance could be framed as a counsel of prudence, a way to save lives once victory was no longer feasible. On the other, in the paranoid atmosphere of 1944, any suggestion of accommodation could be interpreted as disloyalty or even treason. Rommel navigated this terrain with a complexity that reflected his own divided loyalties. He had accepted honors and visibility from the regime. He had been used as an exemplar in propaganda, and Joseph Goebbels and other ministers profited from his popularity. Yet Rommel did not share the ideological fanaticism of many Nazi elites. His focus was primarily military and increasingly humanitarian within the grim calculus of war. Reports from those close to him indicate he was deeply troubled when confronted with what might follow a prolonged urban and industrial campaign across Germany. The destruction of cities, the civilian toll, the collapse of social order, these would be the war's lasting stains. At the same time, Rommel's actions were bound by practical constraints.
He could not publicly repudiate Hitler without risking immediate suspension, arrest, or worse. Nor could he count on a unified officer corps to follow him into some negotiated settlement. The German military apparatus was fragmented, and within it were factions loyal to different aims. Some committed to a fanatic defense, others to a more cynical preservation of personal power. Rommel's approach, therefore, relied on persuasion. He sought to convince his superiors that negotiation with the Western Allies, if not an unconditional surrender, was the only way to prevent needless further carnage. The written record from the period offers hints of these efforts. In mid-July, Rommel authored a missive to the High Command outlining the untenable situation on the Western Front. The precise wording of such private communications is a matter for archives and careful scholarly collation. The broader pattern, however, is clear. He warned of a strategic dead end, highlighted the lack of fuel and reserves, and urged consideration of options that would spare civilian populations. That this correspondence came after D-Day and before the summer's dramatic political upheavals is crucial. It shows a man who, confronted with operational realities, moved from military technician to reluctant statesman. Manfred Rommel's memories supply the human texture behind these documents. He recalled his father's palpable frustration with the mismatch between strategy and reality, with commanders who issued orders that could not be fulfilled. He remembered conversations where Rommel lamented not only the loss of material, but the moral cost of fighting on for the sake of political pride. In these private moments, Rommel's public bravery was combined with private anguish. The man who had once rushed into battle to seize a village at night now feared the prospect of millions of senseless deaths. This was the context in which the plea summarized by this film's title emerges. Whether Rommel spoke the exact words "stop the madness and negotiate" in one continuous sentence is less important than the fact that by the end of July, his operational judgment had matured into a plea of that tenor. The wording is shorthand for a stance that combined clear analysis, Allied control of the seas and air, crippled logistics, and an overstretched home front, with moral urgency. To continue under those conditions was to invite wholesale destruction. Presenting this plea as occurring 27 days after D-Day is a narrative choice anchored in the chronology of his mid-July communications and the gradual hardening of his view in the immediate weeks following the invasion. It is worth pausing on what such a plea would mean within the topography of the Third Reich. In a regime where dissent was treated as existential danger, the act of urging negotiations risked branding a man as a defeatist or a traitor. To voice such thoughts was to place oneself outside the rhetoric of total resistance that Hitler and his inner circle propagated. For Rommel, a figure with prestige and public esteem, the risk was amplified. His words could either sway other officers toward pragmatic restraint or be used by the regime to portray a controlled and rehabilitated figure who had never really opposed the Führer's policies. That ambiguity between authentic dissent and potential co-optation would become a central feature of the final months of his life. The internal realpolitik of Berlin also mattered. By July 1944, the Nazi leadership was growing increasingly distrustful and increasingly brutal in its response to perceived treason. The person closest to managing the regime's public image, Joseph Goebbels, had invested heavily in crafting Rommel as a paragon of German soldiering. That same machinery could be turned into two directions. It could elevate Rommel as a loyal symbol even as it neutralized his political influence, or it could, if necessary, erase him in the name of regime security. For Rommel, who had not been an opponent of the regime in the ideological sense, the entanglement was perilous. His prestige created leverage, but it also made him a target once he stepped outside the narrow bounds of acceptable discourse. Against this backdrop, the weeks after D-Day saw an acceleration of events that would test Rommel's ability to act on his convictions. The Western Front was bleeding Germany's strategic reserves, Allied advances were steady, and the political temperature in Berlin was rising. Privately, Rommel sought channels through which to sound the alarm. Letters to superiors, conversations with sympathetic colleagues, and appeals framed in the language of military necessity rather than political dissidence. Publicly, he maintained the disciplined posture of a field marshal, a figure whose duty was to prepare and defend. But behind closed doors, his appeals carried a different tenor.
not a call for surrender, but a push to stop digging a deeper grave by negotiating an end to a conflict no longer winnable at tolerable cost. There is a final piece to this early narrative of 1944 that must be emphasized: the moral dimension of Rommel's turn. Military calculation alone would have been sufficient for many commanders to recommend a strategic withdrawal or a reallocation of forces. For Rommel, however, the calculus incorporated a sense of responsibility to protect civilians and a recognition of the broader collapse that unrestrained war would bring upon Germany and occupied Europe. That sensibility, part professional prudence, part ethical concern, drove him to seek alternatives to total war. It is one thing to argue from maps and supply tables. It is another thing to argue from the human cost written into those tables. Rommel was increasingly motivated by both.
As late July approached, the question was no longer if Rommel saw the scale of the disaster forming, but what he would do about it. Would he find allies within the military hierarchy willing to push for an exit from the spiral of destruction? Would he be able to persuade Hitler or his inner circle that a negotiated cessation of hostilities with the Western Allies could preserve lives and some remnant of state? Or would his counsel be dismissed as defeatist, making him vulnerable to the regime's punitive machinery? The answers to those questions were not yet settled. What had changed was Rommel himself. From a commander who built fortifications and planned counterattacks, he had become, within weeks of the Allied landings, a voice calling for restraint, calling for a halt to the suicidal momentum of the regime. That shift set in motion a chain of events that would expose both his limits and the brutality of a regime determined to silence any hint of moderation. In the days that followed, he would try to steer a course between professional duty and moral imperative, but forces he could not control, the machine of war, the paranoia of Nazi leadership, and the chaotic violence unfolding across Europe were already closing in. The man who had routed columns across the desert and constructed defensive logic on the beaches of France was by late July confronting an even more personal front: how to speak truth to a regime that punished truth. His message, summed up for history as a plea to stop the madness and negotiate, was as much a refusal to accept further annihilation as it was a last-ditch attempt at practical statecraft. The stakes of that plea were immense, because to suggest negotiation was to challenge the very premise of Hitler's rule, that Germany must fight on regardless of cost. As Rommel marshaled his arguments and tried to find channels for his warnings, the political scene around him convulsed. Conspiracies were forming in disparate circles, some contemplating the removal of Hitler by force, others still hoping for a negotiated recalibration of power. Rommel's posture placed him somewhere between these currents, neither an active conspirator in the plots that would unfold, nor an unquestioning supporter of total resistance. His position was precarious. To be suspected would be to invite ruin, to merely advise would risk being ignored. In the closing days of July, the consequences of having publicly or even privately articulated a stance favoring negotiation began to crystallize into personal danger. Rommel's standing made him scrutinized, and in the volatile political environment, that scrutiny could be lethal. The following weeks would see an attack, a wounding, a political purge, and ultimately a confrontation that no battlefield experience could have prepared him for.
But before that storm broke fully upon him, there was the sober, almost unbelievable act of a senior Wehrmacht commander speaking, in private and in writing, with a clarity rarely seen in the heart of the regime. The war, at least in the West, could not be won under current leadership, and for the sake of survival, some kind of negotiated end should be considered. That conviction, arriving by our reckoning 27 days after the Normandy landings, was the pivot. It drew a line between Rommel the tactician and Rommel the reluctant statesman. It set into motion reactions from Berlin that would test loyalties and endanger lives. And it placed a man who had been the face of German military prowess in a position so fraught with moral weight that his choices would be judged long after the guns fell silent. The pivot of Rommel's private convictions sent ripples through a system that tolerated no fissures. Within days of his shift toward negotiation, events accelerated in a way that would leave him impotent to act on the very counsel he had begun to press. On July 17, 1944, a routine trip turned catastrophic. While traveling in a staff car close to the Western Front, Rommel's vehicle was caught in an Allied air attack. The strafing left him gravely wounded, shrapnel and severe injuries to his head and body that would require immediate evacuation and extended medical care. For a commander whose presence and prompt decisions had been credited with shoring up morale and stiffening defenses, the timing could not have been worse. Immobilized and removed from operational command, Rommel suddenly found the channels through which he might press his new argument abruptly narrowed. The wound did more than take him off the field. It changed his ability to influence. While he convalesced in hospitals back in Germany, the Western Front continued to convulse. The Allied advance in Normandy, though costly, was persistent. German units, hampered by shortages of fuel and the ever-present threat of Allied air interdiction, could not mount the coordinated counterattacks that might have altered the odds. The very conditions Rommel had warned about, fragmented reserves, denied reinforcement routes, and an enemy dominant in the air and sea, played out with brutal clarity. At the same time, Berlin's political temperature had reached a fever pitch. On July 20th, a conspiratorial attempt to assassinate Adolf Hitler culminated in the bomb plot at the Wolfschanze, the East Prussian headquarters. The attempt failed to kill the Führer, but it tore through the regime's facade of control. The response was swift and merciless: arrests, show trials, executions, and a purge of anyone even remotely suspected of wavering loyalty. The Hitler regime's reaction was not only punitive, it was performative, designed to terrify and to bind the military once more to unquestioning obedience. Rommel's position in this maelstrom was precarious by proximity and by reputation.
He had not been an active architect of the July 20 conspiracy. Historical records suggest he was never part of the inner circle planning the assassination. Yet he had been in contact, in the weeks and months before the attempt, with officers who wanted a new course. Some conspirators had hoped to enlist him. He had not given them the unequivocal commitment they sought. His stance, pushing for negotiations rather than a violent overthrow, kept him marginal to the plot's operational core. Still, in the paranoiac sweep of the regime's retaliation, such distinctions mattered little. Accusations piled up. Those in power needed scapegoats, and the regime had long learned to turn ambiguity into guilt. Rommel's earlier popularity was a double-edged sword. It made him influential, but it also meant that any whisper of dissent could be amplified into a narrative of betrayal. For the Nazi leadership, the optics of neutralizing Rommel without creating a martyr were attractive. He was too valuable an emblem to be publicly disgraced in the way other conspirators were meant to be. Yet he was also too dangerous an influence if left free to press for accommodation or to symbolize a fissure in military loyalty. Thus, the regime faced a grim calculus. Rommel's injuries provided both cover and opportunity. A wounded national hero could be managed, silenced, and if necessary removed with minimal risk of immediate public upheaval. High-ranking officers, agents of the regime's desire for stability, approached his home not with open trial and a public condemnation, but with a coercive bargain. The choice presented to him was stark and framed in terms designed to secure public acquiescence: accept a private death that would be presented as the consequence of wounds sustained in service, or face a highly public trial for treason that would put his family, his reputation, and the fragile morale of the Wehrmacht at risk. On October 14, 1944, Rommel was summoned into a fateful meeting. The precise chain of conversations and the exact wording offered to him are matters historians have pieced together from memoirs, official reports, and family recollections. What is clear is the nature of the ultimatum. The regime's representatives told him he could take his own life quietly and be given full military honors, or be subjected to the Volksgerichtshof, the People's Court, a spectacle notorious for its theatrical denunciations and summary executions. Taken in the context of early autumn 1944, with the Soviet and Allied pressures mounting on opposite fronts, the decision was presented as practical as well as existential. Rommel chose to accept the quieter option. In private, he asked to be spared the spectacle and to protect his family from the further vengeance that trial and condemnation would almost certainly invite.
Offered cyanide by representatives of the regime and led to understand that this path would preserve his honors and spare those he loved, he ingested the fatal potion. He died that day. The official announcement framed his end as a consequence of the earlier wounds sustained in Normandy, an explanation that the regime used to construct a narrative of loyalty, sacrifice, and steadfastness, even in defeat. The public handling of Rommel's death showcased the regime's mastery of image. Joseph Goebbels and other propagandists worked quickly to fold Rommel back into the tapestry of a loyal hero whose service merited the highest honors. A state funeral was arranged. Military decorations were displayed. Newspapers and radio broadcasts celebrated a life of martial virtue. The message was carefully calibrated. Rommel did not fall victim to the stain of treason. He suffered as a soldier in the service of his country. This manipulation of legacy obscured the deeper, messier truth that Rommel had, in the weeks after D-Day, adopted a stance that in any other climate might have been judged prudent, if politically impossible at the time. The personal aftermath was devastating for his family. Manfred Rommel and Lucy, his wife, were left to process both grief and the bitter knowledge of what had been demanded of their patriarch. Manfred's later reflections conveyed the pain of knowing that his father had been coerced into a death designed to protect others from regime vengeance. He remembered the manner in which the state had attempted to wrap the loss in ceremony, to convert a coerced exit into a tidy story of honor. That story, for those who lived it, felt like another act of theft. that the truth of a man's final convictions could be appropriated and rebadged by the same apparatus he had come quietly and too late to oppose. The immediate consequence for the Wehrmacht and for Germany was chillingly practical: the removal, voluntary under coercion, of a commander with Rommel's experience, judgment, and, crucially, public stature weakened the already strained command structure. In the months that followed, Germany lost not only a battlefield presence, but a potential voice of moderation inside a military increasingly monopolized by hardliners and zealots. If one of the perverse costs of totalitarian control is the elimination of those who might temper extremism, Rommel's end stands as a stark example. After the war, Rommel's legacy became a subject of decades-long debate and contestation. Early narratives, shaped by Allied needs and post-war German society, often emphasized his tactical brilliance and distanced him from the political crimes of the regime. The image of the honorable Wehrmacht officer who had resisted Nazi excesses in private was convenient for a Europe trying to rebuild and to integrate defeated German society back into a fragile peace. Over time, historianly work grew more nuanced.
Scholars probed the limits of Rommel's dissent, examined the degree to which he had been complicit in a military institution operating in concert with a genocidal political project, and explored how the regime's propaganda both elevated and ultimately betrayed him. These debates matter because they speak to larger questions. How should we remember military leadership that operated within criminal regimes? Can an individual's tactical skill be separated from the political context in which it is applied? And what moral weight attaches to late-coming attempts to avert catastrophe? Rommel forces us to answer these questions without easy certainties. On one level, his case is the story of a professional soldier confronting a military reality he had neither created nor could now control. His calculation that continued fighting in the West was ruinous was born of the same practical military thinking that had made him famous. On another level, his situation underscores the limits of moral agency within authoritarian systems. The space between private conviction and public action is shaped by fear, coercion, and the ever-looming prospect of violent reprisal. Rommel's plea to stop the madness and negotiate, as this narrative frames it 27 days after D-Day, was an attempt to bend policy through the only means a man like him still possessed: reputation and counsel. When those means failed, when paralysis and repression closed around him, the price was catastrophic. Equally important is what Rommel's experience tells us about the costs of losing moderating voices. In any political system, the removal of figures capable of bridging the gap between hardline ideology and pragmatic governance accelerates radicalization. In Nazi Germany's final year, the sidelining of experienced officers who advocated for restraint left decisions increasingly in the hands of those for whom maximal resistance was an article of faith. The result was a spiral of destruction that extended well beyond the battlefield into the fabric of civilian life across Europe. There is also the question of narrative ownership. The way Rommel's death was framed by the regime, the state funeral, the public rhetoric, illustrated how a government can recast private dissent as a loyal sacrifice, thereby neutralizing its critical power. In the post-war years, different actors, Allied governments, German society, veterans groups, and historians, contested that recasting. Each version of Rommel's story served distinct ends. Some rehabilitated a soldier's reputation to ease reintegration. Others emphasized complicity to guard against historical amnesia. Returning to the scene on the beaches of Normandy, where the story begins, the human cost of those choices becomes visible. The Allied landings were, for the soldiers who were there, the literal measure of violence. Men storming fortified positions, mortally confronting the regime's defensive machinery.
For Rommel, witnessing the aftermath and the subsequent weeks of attrition crystallized a moral judgment about the scale of suffering the war would produce if left to proceed unchecked. His plea for negotiation, therefore, must be read not as a simple act of contrition, nor as a redemptive moral conversion, but as the desperate calculation of a man who had been trained to read risk and who now saw ruin mapped in supply tables and casualty lists. Manfred Rommel's later efforts to preserve his father's memory were shaped by this ambivalence. He sought to honor a man who had been a father and a soldier, while also grappling with the political realities that had shaped his decisions. Post-war Germany's reckoning with figures like Erwin Rommel required acknowledging both competence and moral compromise, valor and entanglement. For many, remembering meant resisting the temptation to convert a complex life into a simple moral exemplar.
Historians in subsequent decades dug into archival records, personal letters, and contemporaneous reports to reconstruct both Rommel's military thinking and his private politics. The record, while never offering absolute clarity on every detail, supports a picture of a commander who, confronted with operational collapse and civilian catastrophe, advocated for a way to minimize further destruction. Whether that advocacy could realistically have led to a negotiated settlement that preserved some degree of dignity for Germany and spared lives is an open and painful question. The political realities of Hitler's inner circle, the fragmentation of military authority, and the Allies' own strategic imperatives all complicated any such possibility. Yet the moral resonance of Rommel's turn persists. In modern memory, the image of a celebrated general pleading to stop the madness and negotiate, placed deliberately 27 days after D-Day in this narrative, serves as a concentrated moment of tragic clarity, a seasoned commander famed for tactical daring, confronting the limits of military solutions and the human cost of ideological obstinacy. It is a story of prudence colliding with paranoia, of reputation co-opted by propaganda, and of a life circumscribed by the brutal choices a totalitarian regime could force upon even its most honored servants. There are lessons that extend beyond this specific historical episode. One concerns the fragility of professional ethics under political coercion. Another concerns the tragic calculus faced by those who see the end of a project and must decide whether to keep up the fight in the name of loyalty or to seek a settlement in the name of survival. Rommel's choice, private counsel for negotiation, then the enforced silencing of his voice, illustrates how the structure of power can foreclose options that might otherwise mitigate suffering. Finally, it is worth reflecting on the human dimensions that underlie strategic decisions.
Rommel's argument for negotiation was rooted in an awareness of civilian vulnerability and a refusal to consign streets and towns to annihilation when military victory was no longer plausible. That regard for non-combatants, however incomplete or belated, differentiates strategic calculation from cold militarism. It complicates any simple moral verdict. It challenges us to hold multiple truths together. Rommel was a brilliant and ruthless practitioner of mechanized war, and, later, a man who recognized the pointlessness of prolonging slaughter. Both are true. Neither fully redeems nor wholly damns the other. As we watch images of beaches, bunkers, and the battered towns of wartime Europe, Rommel's story forces us to confront the human cost of both action and inaction. The plea that anchors this film, summed up as a call to stop the madness and negotiate 27 days after D-Day, was an effort to translate battlefield understanding into a policy that might spare lives. It failed, not solely because of one man's fate, but because of a political system that brooked no dissent, and because the machinery of war and reprisal moved with deadly speed. The post-war world has had to make sense of such episodes, to sort through motives, to recover documents, to assay memory against evidence. That work continues. For viewers today, Rommel's arc offers a mirror for questions about leadership, responsibility, and the price of speaking truth in a climate that punishes it. The tragedy is double. The war destroyed cities and millions of lives. The politics of the time removed from public discourse those who might have argued for restraint, even when the chance to avert further catastrophe still flickered. This story closes where it began, with the image of a commander who had once shaped the course of armored warfare, standing, at least for a time, against the grinding calculus of total war. The plea to stop the madness and negotiate endures as a tragic testament, a final, reluctant attempt by a man bound to his profession to steer his country away from needless ruin. His death and the manner of its handling remind us how easily systems can erase complexity, turn dissent into spectacle, and convert private resistance into public myth. For those who wish to explore the sources behind this account, Rommel's letters, contemporary military dispatches, and scholarly research into Operation Fortitude and the politics of July 1944, links to primary documents and further reading are provided in the description. If you found this deep dive illuminating, consider watching our related episodes on the Normandy deception, the July 20 plot, and the Wehrmacht's role in the final year of the war.